The moon of Varan 7 was not a place most people had heard of. It didn't appear in travel guides or diplomatic briefings or any of the documents that got passed around at galactic assembly sessions. It was small and cold and orbited a planet that nobody had found a particularly good reason to care about, sitting at the far edge of the region where human explorers had been quietly pushing their presence outward over the past decade. The kind of place that ends up on maps not because anyone planned to go there specifically but because systematic exploration eventually covers everything, including the unremarkable corners. The outpost there had been running for about 3 years. Station designation HR-7 Varan. Officially classified as a long-term research installation, which was exactly what it was. No more, no less. The people living and working there were scientists, technicians, survey specialists, and the small support staff that kept the lights on and the heating functional and the equipment calibrated. They were studying the moon's geological composition, running deep space observation programs that took advantage of the region's low interference levels, and collecting atmospheric data from the gas giant Varan 7 actually orbited. 312 people in total. They had a small medical bay, a communal dining area, a modest recreation room that doubled as a meeting space, and rows of pressurized habitat modules connected by enclosed walkways. The kind of place that felt cramped for the first few weeks and then started feeling like home around month 3. They had no weapons beyond standard personal equipment. No military designation. No defensive systems worth the name. Nobody had thought they needed them because the moon of Varan 7 was in a part of space that didn't attract conflict. There was nothing there worth fighting over except the research itself, and research stations didn't tend to make enemies. That assumption turned out to be wrong. The Murak Empire had been moving through that region of space for the better part of a year, pushing their territorial boundary outward in the methodical, incremental way they had been doing for decades. They didn't always announce these expansions formally. Sometimes they just moved into unclaimed space, established a presence, and treated any objection as a bureaucratic matter to be handled slowly through channels that most smaller civilizations didn't have the patience or resources to navigate. It was a strategy that worked well for them. Quiet, steady, difficult to oppose directly because no single step was dramatic enough to justify a serious response. When Murak scouts identified the human outpost on Varan 7's moon, they flagged it as an obstacle to a territorial claim the Empire was in the process of formalizing. Not a military obstacle. Not a strategic one. Just something sitting in a location that the Murak had decided was theirs, operated by a species that the Murak had assessed as unlikely to respond with anything beyond formal complaints and diplomatic protests. Commander Vrakos received the scout report on a Thursday morning, between a budget review and a personnel meeting. He read it with the detached efficiency of someone managing a long list of administrative tasks. Research station. No military assets. 312 personnel. Located on a moon within the boundary zone the Empire was claiming. He authorized the strike in about 4 minutes. Signed the order, sent it down the chain, and moved on to the next item on his agenda. The operation itself lasted 20 minutes. After it was done, Vrakos received a brief confirmation, noted it in the territorial claim file as supporting documentation, and went to the officers' dining hall for lunch. He ordered the same thing he usually ordered on Thursdays. He didn't think about it again that afternoon. He filed it as a routine territorial operation, which, from his perspective, it was. On Earth, the damage report arrived at 6 a.m. on a Friday. Colonel Dave Harris was already at his desk when it came through, which was not unusual for him. Harris was the kind of person whose day started before most people's alarms went off, partly because of habit and partly because the job had a way of not respecting normal hours. He was working through routine overnight traffic when the report landed in his queue, flagged urgent by the relay station that had picked up the distress signal before the outpost went dark. He opened it. Read it from top to bottom without stopping. Then he went back and read the casualty section again more slowly. 312 personnel. No survivors recovered. Station HR-7 Varan was no longer transmitting. Harris sat with that for about 30 seconds. Then he stood up, walked down the hall, and pushed open the door to General Mike Flynn's office without knocking. Flynn was at his desk with reading glasses on, going through a briefing document from the night before. He looked up when the door opened without the usual knock, because Harris not knocking meant something was wrong, and Harris's face confirmed it before a word was spoken. Harris crossed the room and placed the report flat on the desk in front of Flynn. He didn't summarize it. He didn't add context. He didn't say anything at all. He just put it down and stood back. Flynn picked it up. He read it with the same slow, complete attention he gave everything, not rushing, not skimming, making sure he understood exactly what he was looking at. When he finished the last page he set it back down on the desk and was quiet for a moment. The room was very still. Then Flynn reached out, picked up his phone and made a call. Harris stood where he was and waited, looking at the report on the desk, thinking about 312 people on a cold moon who had gone to work one morning and never came home. Somewhere in the Murak Empire, Commander Vrakos was finishing his lunch. He had no idea what he had just started. The emergency session was called for 9 in the morning and ran until nearly 10 at night. That's a long time for a single meeting, but nobody suggested breaking early because everyone in that room understood that what got decided before they walked out would shape everything that came after it. These were not people who took that lightly. Around the table sat senior military commanders, government officials, diplomatic advisors, legal counselors, and intelligence analysts, the full cross-section of the people whose job it was to think carefully about exactly this kind of situation before anyone did anything that couldn't be undone. The diplomats went first, which was appropriate because diplomacy is supposed to come first. Their argument was structured and reasonable and delivered with the kind of measured confidence that comes from years of handling international and interstellar crises through channels and processes and carefully worded documents. The Galactic Assembly had a formal complaints mechanism. It was slow, yes, and imperfect, yes, and the Murak Empire had enough political relationships within the Assembly to complicate any proceeding brought against them, yes, but it existed for exactly this kind of situation. A unilateral military response, they argued, set a precedent that made the entire framework of galactic diplomacy less stable for everyone, including humanity. It was a serious argument and it deserved serious consideration and it got it. Then the legal advisors went, and they focused on the question of proportionality. This word came up a lot. Proportional response was a principle with deep roots in both human legal tradition and interstellar conduct agreements that Earth had signed onto over the years. What the Murak had done was an attack on an undefended civilian research installation, which was serious and clearly wrong, but the question of what response was legally and ethically proportional to that attack was genuinely complicated. A military strike against a comparable Murak installation might qualify. Sanctions might qualify. A formal demand for reparations through the assembly process might qualify. What some people in the room were apparently contemplating did not obviously qualify, and the legal team wanted that noted clearly in the record. 3 different officials used the word proportional within the same hour. Flynn counted. He sat at his end of the table and listened to all of it without interrupting, without visibly reacting, without giving any indication of what he was thinking. He had a reputation for that, for being genuinely hard to read in rooms like this one, which made some people uncomfortable and others, who had worked with him long enough, quietly reassured, because it meant he was actually listening rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. He let everyone finish. The room had been going for about 7 hours by that point. People had eaten sandwiches brought in on trays without leaving their seats. Coffee had been refilled multiple times. The arguments had been made, countered, refined, and made again. There was a natural settling that happened when a long meeting reaches the point where everything that can be said has been said and the room starts waiting for someone to move toward a conclusion. Flynn reached into the folder in front of him and took out a photograph. He didn't stand up. He didn't make a speech. He just placed it flat on the table and slid it toward the center where everyone could see it. It was a single image taken by a reconnaissance drone that had passed through the Varan 7 system after the strike. It showed what was left of Station HR-7 Varan on the surface of the moon. The pressurized habitat modules. The walkways. The communal areas where 312 people had eaten their meals and had their conversations and gone about the ordinary business of their days. The photograph showed what the Murak strike had done to all of that. Flynn didn't explain it. He didn't add context or commentary. He just left it there in the middle of the table and let everyone look at it for as long as they needed to. Nobody spoke for almost 2 minutes. When the vote came, it wasn't close. The resolution that passed authorized a full military response against the Murak Empire with no operational ceiling, meaning the commanders given the mission would not be restricted to specific target categories or limited strike parameters. Full deployment. Full production capacity from Earth's shipyards directed toward the operation. Every available resource committed without the usual peacetime constraints on scale and scope. The diplomats who had argued for the assembly process voted yes. The legal advisors who had spent an hour on proportionality voted yes. Everyone in that room voted yes. The news of the resolution reached the broader galactic community through intelligence channels and diplomatic networks over the following days, and the reaction was something between discomfort and genuine alarm. Not because humanity had decided to respond, that was expected. What unsettled people was the scale of what had been approved. Other species responded to attacks with counterstrikes, task forces, targeted operations sized to match the original provocation. Humanity had apparently looked at the destruction of a single research outpost and authorized their entire war machine. The word disproportionate appeared in a lot of intelligence reports that week. Captain Lena Brooks heard about her assignment through Colonel Harris, who came to find her in the ship's simulation bay where she had been running tactical exercises with her crew. Harris walked in, waited for her to notice him, and handed her a mission file without preamble. Brooks was 34 years old. She had been commissioned at 22 and had spent 12 years earning a reputation for being exactly the kind of officer you wanted running a complex operation. Not because she was fearless, which was a quality that sounded good but often got people killed, but because she was precise. She thought clearly under pressure. She made decisions without freezing, and she didn't make them recklessly either. She sat somewhere in the careful middle ground between caution and decisiveness that good command required. She read the mission file standing up, right there in the simulation bay. When she finished, she looked at Harris and asked one question. She wanted to confirm that the operational parameters she was reading were accurate, that there genuinely was no ceiling on the mission scope. Harris told her the parameters were accurate. Brooks closed the file. She looked at the simulation bay around her, at her crew running through their exercises, and was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would need 48 hours to finalize her fleet deployment plan. Harris nodded and left. Brooks stood alone for a moment longer, holding the mission file, thinking through what it meant and what it was going to require and what came after it. Her orders were one sentence long. They had not told her how. They had not told her what specific targets to prioritize or what timeline to follow or what level of force to apply at each stage. They had just told her to make sure the Murak never considered doing this again. She intended to do exactly that. Lieutenant Ray Cooper was 29 years old and had been in the room for about 3 hours before he said anything. That wasn't unusual for him. Cooper was not the kind of person who talked to fill silence. He had learned early in his career that in rooms full of senior officers and experienced commanders, the fastest way to stop being taken seriously was to speak before you had something worth saying. So he listened. He absorbed. He took notes on the physical notepad he carried everywhere, which a few people had quietly made fun of over the years because nobody used paper anymore, and he kept his mouth shut until he had something that needed to be said out loud. The planning session had been running since 7 in the morning. It was a final coordination meeting before the fleet deployment, logistics, timing, operational sequencing, the kind of detailed groundwork that turned a broad strategic decision into an actual executable plan. The people in the room were experienced and focused, and the work they were doing was serious and competent. Cooper was the youngest person there by at least 8 years, and he was there because Flynn had a policy of including junior officers in senior planning sessions on the grounds that different perspectives occasionally caught things that experienced eyes missed through sheer familiarity. Most of the time in these sessions Cooper observed and learned and kept his contributions small. This time was different. Around the middle of the afternoon, when the conversation had moved through the operational phases and arrived at the timeline section, Cooper looked down at his notepad and then looked up at the room and said he had something he wanted to raise before they locked the schedule. The room gave him the floor the way rooms give junior officers the floor, politely, briefly, with the unspoken expectation that this would be a small point quickly addressed. Cooper said they should send a warning to the Murak homeworld before the fleet arrived. A public broadcast, clear and direct, giving the civilian population advance notice of what was coming and enough time to move away from areas that would be affected. He suggested 48 hours as a minimum window. The silence that followed lasted about 2 seconds. Then about half the room responded at once. The objections came fast and from multiple directions. A warning told the Murak exactly when the fleet was moving, which gave their military time to prepare additional defensive measures. A warning gave the Murak government time to spin the situation politically, to present themselves as victims of aggression to the Galactic Assembly before the operation even began. A warning potentially complicated the operational parameters by introducing civilian movement patterns into areas the fleet needed to work through. And perhaps most directly, the Murak had given no warning to 312 people on a research station before they were killed. The question of why humanity owed the Murak a courtesy the Murak had not extended sat heavy in the air of that room without anyone quite saying it plainly. Cooper stood and absorbed all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't get defensive. He waited until the objections had run their course and then he said, quietly and clearly, that he understood every point that had been made and he wasn't dismissing any of them. But he said there was a difference between what the Murak had done and what humanity was capable of doing, and that difference mattered. Not to the Murak. Not to the operation. To humanity itself. To the people in that room and the ones who sent them and the civilization they were acting on behalf of. When this was over, when the fleet came home and the reports were written and history started forming its record of what had happened, the question of whether humanity had given a warning before acting would be part of that record permanently. You couldn't add it later. You couldn't revise it in. He said he wasn't arguing against the mission. He wasn't asking for the terms to be softened or the operational scope to be reduced. He was asking for 48 hours and a broadcast. The other half of the room, the half that hadn't immediately pushed back, was quiet in a different way than before. Not convinced necessarily, but thinking. There's a particular quality to silence in a room when an argument has landed somewhere real, and this had a version of that quality. Flynn had been sitting at the head of the table through all of it without speaking. This was normal for Flynn in planning sessions. He listened more than he talked, and when he did talk, people paid attention, partly because of his rank and partly because of the straightforward reality that he didn't waste words. He had been watching Cooper make his argument and watching the room respond, and he had not given any visible indication of where he was landing. When the back and forth settled, Flynn looked at Cooper for a moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he said the warning would be sent. He didn't elaborate at length. He said what he said in the same even tone he used for logistics decisions and timeline confirmations. The warning would go out 48 hours before the fleet arrived. He told the communications team to draft something clear and factual. No threats, no political language, just a direct statement of what was coming and how much time people had. He said one more thing before moving on. He said that the mission didn't change. The operation didn't change. But when it was all over, humanity needed to be able to look at itself clearly in the record of what had been done, and a warning was part of that. Nobody argued with him. The warning was drafted that evening and transmitted the following morning through every open channel that reached Murak space. Civilian broadcasts, diplomatic frequencies, public relay networks. It was short and plain and unmistakable in its meaning. It named what was coming. It gave the timeline. It told civilians to move away from military infrastructure and population centers near strategic installations. The Murak government received it within hours. Their public response was immediate and confident. Officials went on record calling it a psychological operation, a tactic designed to cause panic and disrupt normal life without any real military follow-through behind it. The logic they offered their people was straightforward. Humanity didn't have the capability to back up a threat of this scale. No species at Earth's stage of development could project that kind of force against a Murak homeworld. The whole thing was designed to make them anxious and compliant without a single shot being fired. They called it a bluff. They told their people to stay calm, go about their normal routines, and trust that the Empire's defenses were more than adequate for anything that was actually coming. Some Murak civilians believed them completely. Some didn't and quietly left anyway. 47 hours later, Captain Lena Brooks' fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Murak home system, right on schedule, exactly where the warning had said they would be. It was not a bluff. The Murak had been building their homeworld's defenses for a long time. Not years. Generations. The orbital defense grid around Murak Prime was the kind of infrastructure that gets added to slowly over decades, each administration inheriting what the previous one built and expanding it a little further, upgrading the older systems, filling in gaps identified by the latest threat assessments. It wasn't the product of a single military program or a specific moment of alarm. It was the accumulated result of a civilization that had been powerful long enough to build the kind of defenses that powerful civilizations build when they want to make sure they stay that way. By the time Captain Brooks' fleet arrived at the edge of the Murak home system, the defense grid consisted of multiple overlapping layers. Outer sensor arrays that could detect incoming threats at extreme range and feed targeting data to everything further in. Long-range missile platforms positioned to engage a fleet before it could close to effective weapons range. A network of automated gun stations in high orbit that provided dense, overlapping fields of fire against anything that made it through the outer layers. Fighter launch facilities stationed at 3 points around the planet's equatorial orbit. And at the innermost layer, the planet's own surface-based defense batteries, heavy, powerful, built into reinforced installations that had been designed to survive significant bombardment and keep firing. The Murak Military Command had run projections on this grid many times over the years, testing it against various threat scenarios, updating their estimates as the strategic picture in their region of space evolved. Their most recent assessment, conducted less than a year before Brooks arrived, had concluded that the grid was capable of defeating any realistic attack force that a species at humanity's current development level could assemble. That assessment was about to become one of the most expensive mistakes in Murak military history. Brooks had spent the 48 hours of transit time between the fleet's departure and its arrival doing what she always did before an operation: going over the plan until she knew it well enough that she didn't have to think about it during execution. She had her tactical team run scenarios. She had her department heads brief and rebrief their sections. She ate her meals at her desk and slept 4 hours a night and spent the rest of the time making sure that when the moment came, her fleet would move like a single organism rather than 30 separate ships trying to coordinate on the fly. She had looked at the Murak defense grid data carefully. The grid was formidable. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise or let her crew pretend otherwise either, because underestimating a serious defensive system was how you took casualties you didn't need to take. But formidable wasn't the same as unbeatable, and the grid had a characteristic that Brooks had identified early and built her entire approach around. It was designed to stop a charge. The Murak military planners who had built and updated the grid over the years had consistently optimized it against the most straightforward form of attack. A fleet pushing hard toward the planet, trying to close distance quickly, absorbing losses while punching through the layers by force. Against that kind of attack, the grid was genuinely excellent. The overlapping fields of fire, the layered depth, the automated response systems. All of it was tuned to handle an opponent who was in a hurry. Brooks was not in a hurry. When the fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the Murak sensors lit up across the system, Brooks gave her first order of the engagement. She told the fleet to hold at current position and begin long-range assessment. No advance. No aggressive posture. Just sensors running, data collecting, the fleet sitting at the outer edge of the system like it had all the time in the world. The Murak Defense Command scrambled immediately. Their automated systems came to full alert status and their military commanders took their positions and the entire defensive apparatus oriented itself toward the incoming fleet, ready for the charge that was supposed to come next. The charge didn't come. Brooks waited 4 hours at long range before she moved, and when she moved it wasn't toward the planet. She sent a small fast group of ships in a wide arc around the system's outer edge, not attacking anything, just repositioning. The defense grid's automated targeting systems tracked them and adjusted. That adjustment created a small change in coverage angles on the opposite side of the grid. It was a minor change. It lasted less than 2 minutes before the system corrected. Brooks had been watching for exactly that kind of minor change. She filed it away and waited. Over the next several hours she probed the grid the way you probe something you're trying to fully understand before you commit to anything irreversible. Not attacking in the conventional sense. Applying pressure here, movement there, watching how the grid responded, mapping the patterns of its automated corrections, identifying the points where response time was slightly slower and the points where coverage overlapped so heavily that no approach was viable. She was building a complete picture of how the grid actually behaved under real conditions rather than how it looked on paper. Her crew was quiet during this phase. Focused. A few of the less experienced officers found the patience difficult. They were ready, the fleet was ready, and the slow methodical probing felt like delay. One of her junior tactical officers asked during a brief lull whether they were waiting for something specific. Brooks told him they were waiting until she knew exactly what she was doing before she did it. She said it without irritation, just as a plain statement of her operating philosophy. The officer nodded and went back to his station. At the 11-hour mark from their arrival, Brooks gave the order to begin the actual dismantling of the grid. What followed was not a dramatic pitched battle in the way that military engagements are sometimes described afterward. It was more like a very precise, very methodical process of removal. Brooks attacked the grid's components in a specific sequence she had worked out during the probing phase, not the most obvious targets first, but the components whose removal would create cascading vulnerabilities in the systems connected to them. She took out a relay station that 3 automated platforms depended on for targeting coordination. The platforms didn't shut down but their response accuracy dropped measurably. She used that drop to neutralize 2 of the long-range missile batteries that had been covering an approach angle she needed. With those batteries down, the approach angle opened enough to bring a secondary group of her fleet into a new position, which then had a clear line to a fighter launch facility that had been difficult to reach before. Each step created the conditions for the next step. Her crew executed it cleanly. There were difficult moments. The Murak defense systems were well built and their military commanders were not passive observers. They adapted where they could, rerouted what they could reroute, pushed their remaining systems hard to compensate for the pieces being stripped away. Brooks respected that. She factored it into her adjustments and kept moving. 11 hours after the dismantling began, it was finished. The defense grid around Murak Prime was gone. Not damaged. Not degraded. Gone, cleared away layer by layer until there was nothing left between Brooks' fleet and the planet below except empty space. She gave one order. Hold position. The fleet stopped where it was and went still. Every ship sitting in clear formation, completely visible on every Murak sensor still functioning on the surface. No cloaking. No evasive movement. Just there, 30 ships hanging above the planet in the silence where a defense grid used to be, and not doing anything else. Brooks didn't fire on the surface. She just waited. Down on Murak Prime, in the command center where the military high command had been managing the defense of their homeworld for the past 11 hours, something happened that no defense briefing and no threat assessment and no strategic projection had ever prepared them for. They had planned for an attack. They had trained for an attack. They had built an entire generational infrastructure specifically to defeat an attack. What they were looking at now wasn't an attack. It was a fleet sitting above their undefended world in complete silence, doing nothing in no apparent hurry. And somehow that was worse. The waiting broke something that the fighting hadn't managed to touch. Because the fighting had given them something to do, systems to reroute, orders to give, the focused urgency of active response. The waiting gave them nothing except the full, unobstructed view of where they actually were. Defenseless. Exposed. Completely at the mercy of a fleet that was apparently in no rush to exercise that mercy one way or the other. One of the Murak commanders at the table looked at the sensor display for a long time. Then he quietly asked someone to open a diplomatic channel. The transmission came through at 4 a.m. Earth Standard Time. Captain Lena Brooks was in her command chair when it arrived, which was where she had been for most of the past 18 hours. She hadn't slept much. Not because she was anxious, she had moved past anxiety somewhere around hour 6 of stripping the Murak defense grid, but because stepping away from the chair during an active operation felt wrong to her in a way she couldn't fully explain. Some commanders delegated well and rested in shifts. Brooks preferred to stay close to the situation until the situation was resolved. It was just how she was built. The fleet had been holding position above Murak Prime for several hours by that point. Defense grid gone. Orbital platforms neutralized. Nothing left between her ships and the planet's surface except atmosphere. She had not given the order to fire on the surface. She had simply held position and waited, which turned out to be the most effective thing she could have done, because the waiting was apparently worse for the Murak High Command than the engagement itself had been. When the surrender transmission came in, her communications officer flagged it immediately and put it on her screen. Brooks read it. Read it again. Then she told her communications officer to acknowledge receipt and inform the Murak government that the transmission had been received and was being reviewed. Professional. Neutral. Nothing in her voice that sounded like relief or satisfaction or anything else that might complicate the moment. She forwarded it to General Flynn on Earth and waited. Flynn received it at his desk, which was where Colonel Harris found him when he arrived at the building that morning. Already there, already reading, coffee going cold the same way it always did when something had his full attention. Harris stood in the doorway and Flynn looked up and gave a single nod that answered the question Harris hadn't asked yet. It was over. Not the paperwork. Not the formal process. Not the long complicated work of turning a military outcome into a durable political reality. That was all still ahead. But the part that involved warships and defense grids and the specific terrible weight of what the fleet had been prepared to do, that part was over. Flynn called his team in and they began drafting the terms. The terms took 2 days to finalize and they were not gentle. They were not designed to be. The people writing them had thought carefully about what outcome they were trying to create. Not just an end to this particular conflict, but a set of conditions that made a future version of this conflict as unlikely as possible. That required terms with real weight. Terms that lasted. Terms that the Murak would feel in practical daily ways for years and decades to come. Full demilitarization was the first condition. The Murak Empire's military capacity would be reduced to a level sufficient only for basic internal security functions. Their shipyards would be retooled. Their weapons programs would be shut down and verified as shut down through ongoing inspection access that humanity and a neutral assembly committee would maintain indefinitely. Building back up in secret would be possible in theory but would take long enough that the attempt would almost certainly be detected. The reparations came next. The specific figures were calculated not to be symbolic but to be real, sized to the actual damage done, including not just the physical destruction of the outpost but the full accounting of what 312 lives represented in every way a number could represent a life. The total was large enough that the Murak economy would be managing the payments for decades. Every budget cycle for a generation of Murak leadership would have that line in it, visible and unavoidable. But the third condition was the one that generated the most debate on the Murak side during the signing process. It was the one their legal team pushed back on hardest and the one that humanity's negotiators, led by a quiet and immovable diplomat named Patrick Ward, did not move on at all. The Murak Empire would include a formal written acknowledgement of what they had done to station HR-7 Varan in every official diplomatic communication they sent for the next 50 years. Not buried in an appendix. Not reduced to coded legal language that obscured its meaning. A plain, clear statement of what happened, who did it, and what it cost. Attached to every treaty negotiation, every trade agreement, every formal address to the Galactic Assembly, every communique sent to another civilization's government. 50 years. The Murak legal team argued that this was unprecedented. Patrick Ward agreed that it was unprecedented and explained that it had been written that way on purpose, because what the Murak had done was also unprecedented, and the acknowledgement needed to match the act. They signed it on the fourth day. The news moved through the galaxy the way significant things moved, fast through official channels, faster through unofficial ones. Intelligence services updated their files. Diplomatic offices drafted internal memos. Species that had been watching the situation with varying degrees of concern absorbed the outcome and drew their own conclusions. What changed wasn't loud. Nobody issued a formal declaration about humanity's new status in the galactic order. There was no ceremony or announcement. It was subtler than that. It was the way the tone shifted in how other civilizations talked about Earth in their internal communications. A quiet recalibration of assessments that had been built on older information and now needed updating. Before this, humanity had been categorized in most serious intelligence files as a capable and growing species worth monitoring, with military potential that was developing but not yet fully understood. The kind of assessment you gave a civilization that was on an upward trajectory and might eventually become a significant factor. An old alien historian named Veldos, who had spent his long career documenting the rise and fall of empires and considered himself difficult to surprise, sat in his study and went through the complete record of the conflict from beginning to end. The strike on the outpost. The single day it took Earth to make its decision. The scale of the response that decision produced. The warning that went out 48 hours before the fleet arrived. The 11 hours it took to dismantle the Murak defense grid. The hours of silence while the fleet held position and waited without firing. He wrote one line in his historical record and closed the document. He didn't write that humanity had destroyed a planet because they hadn't. The planet was still there. The Murak people were still there. The buildings and cities and everything that made up the ordinary life of that world were intact. What humanity had destroyed was something less visible and more permanent. They had destroyed the assumption, the comfortable, widespread, quietly held assumption that had existed across the galaxy in various forms, that hitting humanity carried a manageable cost. That a strike against a human outpost was the kind of thing you could file as a routine territorial operation and walk away from. That assumption was gone now. Completely and permanently gone. And once something like that is gone, it doesn't come back because the memory of what replaced it is too clear. Veldos closed his study and went home. Back on Earth, Flynn was still at his desk when the final confirmation of the signed terms came through. Harris brought it to him in person, the same way Harris had brought him the damage report on that early Friday morning that had started all of this. He set the document on the desk. Flynn read it. Looked at it for a moment after he finished. Then he opened the bottom drawer, took out the photograph, the one from Varan 7, the one he had placed on the table in that meeting room without saying a word, and looked at it one more time. He put it back in the drawer. He locked it. He never took it out again.